Well, okay. Welcome everyone to the colloquium this afternoon. I'm delighted to invite Professor Gautam Menon, who is a professor of physics and biology at Ashoka University and the Indian Institute of Mathematical Sciences, Chennai. He did his PhD work at the IISc Bangalore and then has studied and worked at numerous institutions in the country and abroad. I would encourage you to visit his faculty website to get a sense for the range of his work. One of the areas of which includes modeling infectious diseases. And I must confess, I learned about his work after the, after the COVID-19 problem broke out. And ever since then, there's been a media babble of sorts around the matter. And I must say that Gautam's commentaries, careful and sober and calm and always grounded, have stood out for the care and he's brought to the discussion. The talk that he'll give us today is titled COVID-19, Looking at the Big Picture. So over to Gautam.
Thank you so much, Chandan, and thank you to APU for this invitation. Let me put my screen on, and let me just confirm with you that you're able to see my screen, my full screen.
Yes.
Okay, good. So as I said, thank you again for this invitation to speak at APU. I want to tell you a little bit about what we understand about COVID-19 now, but I want to first remind you that I was actually a speaker at a similar APU event organized together with the Bangalore International Center around on the 27th of February. So that's about 9 months ago. So the title of that talk was Coronavirus, the Next Pandemic. And I just want to draw your attention to the question mark after pandemic. So why did I put that question mark? And what was it that we were thinking then about what could happen in the future? What were the sort of issues that were perplexing us about COVID-19 at that point? In fact, the name COVID-19 had sort of barely been chosen by then. So the questions I want to ask is, what's happened since, both in the world and in India? What did we get right and what did we get wrong? Because with the benefit of full hindsight, even though we're not really through the pandemic yet, we still now have some idea based on the past 9 months odd of experience of what went right and what didn't go quite right. What have we learned from our experience and what might happen in the future? These are the questions that I want to be able to pose to you. And I want to compare what I said essentially in the February talk, which is online at the Bangalore International Center website. But compare that to what I said then to what I'm going to say now. And it's going to be a fairly different talk because the things I'm going to emphasize now are very different from the sorts of things that I emphasized in that talk. So the nice thing is that I can assume now that by now all of this audience knows that COVID-19 is a disease. It's caused by a virus. The virus is called the SARS-CoV-2 virus. It's a coronavirus, a specific type of virus. And this is the same virus that gave rise, this is the same family of viruses that leads to diseases called SARS and MERS, which are certainly more terrible than COVID-19. This disease originated in China. It originated in animals and then spilled over to human beings and then moved fast between human beings. The disease is untreatable. It has no vaccine. And it spreads primarily through a respiratory route. And hence, the wearing of masks is very essential, as all of you know by now. The other things we know about the disease is that most people will recover from it. Some won't even know that they were actually ill. And the people who are infected by the disease but don't exhibit any symptoms of any sort, not even to themselves, might be called asymptomatic carriers of infection. So the A should come together with the symptomatic, asymptomatic carriers of infection. And there's a long and complex debate about what is the fraction of people who are infected with the disease who will remain asymptomatic. And there are numbers that range all the way from about 30% to about 80 or 90%. And we're still not very clear what that number ought to be. We know now, in fact, we even knew then on the 20th of February, that we were seeing more adverse disease outcomes in older people. So age certainly predisposed you to more adverse outcomes if you were diseased. And then the importance of pre-existing conditions, for example, diabetes or COPD or cardiovascular disease of any sort, was certainly important in determining what trajectory you took after the infection. So here's a picture of the different types of the stages of disease that you might go through. There's been a bunch of people who will remain asymptomatic. About 80% of people who exhibit symptoms will exhibit mild disease. So it's really a fever, fatigue, dry cough, and certain symptoms that will only show up in scans. Possibility of pneumonia is there. If you're above 60 years, above 65 years or so, there's much more likely that you will have some severe consequences of the disease, including the possibility of requiring an ICU treatment at that point. Acute respiratory distress syndrome, cardiac injury, etc., typically will set in for older patients beyond the age of about 60 or 65. And the understanding of all of these consequences, the medical consequences, is evolving, but we certainly know much more now than we did at that time. So looking back at the numbers on the 27th of February 2020, this is what the map of the world looked like in terms of the number of cases. The only real color that you can see is the color associated with China. There's a bunch of countries for which there is no data at all. You can see a little sort of shade of blue around Italy. So that's the beginning of the Italian pandemic. And around Iran, you can still see an even lighter shade. So relatively small numbers of cases. By now, China's epidemic had peaked.
Gautam, sorry to interrupt.
Yeah.
Sorry, we've not been seeing the slides past the inaugural slide.
Oh my God, I've been going steadily through the slides.
Yes, yes.
Okay, all right. Goodness me. Okay, so maybe I just spent can you see the slide now and can you see the following slide?
No, it's still the main slide.
Okay, let me just sort that out. Oh, you're absolutely right. Let's see how to...
The coordinator is suggesting that you reopen the file. I'm not sure if that is... Okay, now we see the...
Now you can see at least something to the edge.
Yes, we can see the margin, but without the remaining slides.
Okay, so let me... that's a bit of... Okay, can you see my second slide?
Yes.
And now my third slide?
Yes.
Okay, so I'll just do it in the painful way, going down one by one of these slides. You won't see the full screen. I hope that's okay.
Yes.
At least this is a fix. Okay, so I'm sorry you missed all of that, but at least here are the pictures that went with the discussion. This was the point where I told you about what I was thinking of on the 27th of February and drew your attention to the fact that that talk had a question mark at the end. I said I was going to address questions of what happened since in the world and in India. What did we get right and what did we get wrong? And what have we learned from our experience? I said that these are all the things that I will now assume that you know. And this is a list of things that I said. COVID-19 is a disease. It's caused by a virus. It originated in China. It's untreatable, etc. I said most people will recover. Some people won't even know that they were ill. And these are asymptomatic carriers of infection. And maybe about 80% of people who are infected by the disease will not exhibit any symptoms. And we still don't know the exact fraction yet of the population. This is the progress of the disease. Not much information in this slide to take away, except for the fact that age is a major risk factor. And exactly what you'll be sick with depends upon roughly how old you are. But if you're in the age group of somewhere between 20 and 40, typically without any pre-existing conditions, the likelihood is that you will not have any severe response to the infection in terms of disease. This is the picture that I just about got to when we were interrupted. My attention was drawn to the fact that you hadn't been seeing these slides. This is a picture of the world, as you can see. And so here, the color coding is by the number of cases, the number of daily cases. And you can only see China here as sort of marked in blue. And at that point, China had about 500 cases. The peak of the Chinese pandemic was at about 5,000 cases, as far as I remember. So we were well past the peak by this point. You can see Italy lightly shaded. You can see Iran lightly shaded. So it was really Italy and Iran at that time which had sort of taken off. The other countries showed maybe 1 or 2 cases. I think India by that point had 3 cases. The US had less than 10. And this is what the world looked like at that point. Going back to history, and now I hope you can see everything from here. So 8th December. So now the timeline has shifted a little bit about what we understand about the disease and when it started. The first recorded case in Wuhan in China was actually 8th December, but they informed the WHO of this cluster of pneumonia cases of unknown origin only by about the 31st of December. They were trying to figure it out before that. By the 9th of January, China announced to the world that they had identified a novel coronavirus as a causative agent of the pneumonia outbreak. On the 13th of January was when the first cases outside China began to be detected. That was the case that was confirmed in Thailand. As far as India goes, on the 15th of January, we had already begun to place restrictions on passengers from China, ensuring that they were monitored and we had all of their details. The 31st of January was the first reported Indian case of a medical student from Wuhan who had come back on vacation from China. By the 5th of February, we had imposed a travel advisory for China, and Wuhan itself was locked down by the 23rd of January. Here's a picture of the flights out of Wuhan by their destination across the period January 18 to 24. And this is just to illustrate how disease spreads in a modern context. So disease spreads because people can now move across long distances in very short time. Someone in Wuhan can reach Moscow or London or Paris or Rome or Istanbul or Dubai or Denpasar or Sydney within a period of about 8 to 12 hours. And these arrows and these locations that you can see are places that people moved out to from Wuhan at a time when the disease was building up, just before Wuhan was completely locked down. By the 28th of February, the World Health Organization had increased its assessment to a very high risk on a global scale. By the 11th of Feb, the name had been given, SARS-CoV-2, and the disease was named COVID-19. On the 11th of March was when the World Health Organization defined COVID-19 as a pandemic. Strictly speaking, this is a bit unusual because the correct categorization was already one that was done earlier by the World Health Organization. This is called a PHEIC, a Public Health Emergency of International Concern. And the WHO didn't like using the word pandemic because it sort of thought it might inspire some level of panic among the public. But already by then, we knew that the disease could move between person to person. So that was established by about the 20th of January. The lockdown in Wuhan happened on the 23rd. In India, there were a cluster of cases beyond, it stayed till about 3 till the end of February. And then there was a cluster of cases mainly associated with an Italian tourist group in early March. By the 4th of March, we were compulsorily screening all international passengers. By the 5th of March, there was an advisory on gatherings. So the whole medical establishment, the government medical establishment was gearing up for what might potentially happen in the future, looking at the cases of Italy and other cases where these numbers had slowly begun to build up, and also looking at the Chinese experience. This is the current picture. So contrast the earlier picture that I showed you with the current picture here. And now you can see all of the colors. Most of the globe really is in some shade of the same blue to dark purple that you can see in the bar at the bottom. India, Russia, Brazil, Argentina, the United States, of course, and to a less and much of Europe at this point again. And also many other parts of the world. South Africa is another point. And you can see Sweden. All of these are countries which have seen some number of cases, daily cases, and are continuing to see them right now. So this is what a pandemic means. And the question mark was, the earlier picture showed it a small number of cases in a fairly restricted number of geographical locations. But here there's no doubt. Right now, around 210 to 220 countries in the world are reporting or have reported cases of COVID-19. This is a global phenomenon, which is why there certainly is no sense in maintaining that question mark anymore. I hope you can see this particular movie, and I don't think I can show it to you without going full screen. Let me just try this, and then I can go back to sort of small screen. I hope you can see this trajectory of cases that you can see going up and down. That's China going up. And then you can see the United States going up, the United Kingdom, Brazil, India, China. I do hope you can see this. If you can't, I would be very disappointed. But this is the development in time of the number of cases. And we'll look at snapshots of these as we go along, and I will explain what they actually mean. So this is the new confirmed COVID cases per day. The last decline that you see is a decline in the India numbers. So let's now move back, and I hope you can come back and see my screen here. I will move now to the next one. This is a picture of the daily deaths. And by the 13th of March, the World Health Organization had declared that Europe was the new epicenter of the pandemic. It wasn't China anymore. And you can see the rise of the Italian cases, and a little later, the increase in the European and the North American cases after that. This is the US numbers, a very, very sharp increase, a huge peak in the daily number of deaths, and then this fairly thick little part that comes out and remains roughly the same thickness as you go along in time. So this is the snapshot of the end result of the movie. And this is the daily cases, daily new cases of COVID-19. This is for India, the United States, Brazil, Italy, possibly the UK as well. You can see that the United States had a peak, had a second peak, and now is again going back up. India, in contrast, had one very gradual but constantly increasing peak, a peak that was much larger in terms of the number of daily cases. But then for the last roughly 4 to 5 weeks from now, we've seen a sustained decrease in the number of cases. This is certainly an interesting point. The question is, have we seen the end of the Indian epidemic, or is this curve guaranteed to go up at some point again for whatever reason? That's something that we might want to discuss as we go along. If you look at the deaths per million people, and this is again an interesting picture, you can see Brazil going up, you can see the US with a large peak coming down. India is a very low line right at the bottom. And that's interesting because it says that India has not seen the number of deaths per unit of its population per million people that these other countries have also seen. So now one needs to go into that particular question. Do we understand anything about why, on average, fewer Indians seem to be dying? So it's useful to expand our view just beyond India and to look at our immediate neighborhood of South Asia. So if you look at India at this date when this was done on a couple of days ago, on the 18th of October, India had about 7.5 million cases and about 114,000 deaths. Pakistan had about 300,000 cases and about 6,000 deaths. Afghanistan, 40,000 and 1,400 deaths. Nepal numbers increasing. Bangladesh, 300,000 cases and about 5,000 deaths. These numbers look either large or small depending upon how you think about them. The useful thing is to normalize them in some way. So this is a plot of the deaths from COVID-19, the cumulative deaths from COVID-19, normalized by the population. Notice, so this is normalized by population is per million people. So Brazil is currently seeing the total number of deaths of COVID-19 in Brazil is around 720 per million. For the United States, that number is 660. For India, the number is 82, and for Pakistan, that number is 30. So there's a factor of roughly about, let's say, 8 to 10, 8 to 9 between India and the other countries which have seen similar numbers in terms of an explosion of cases of COVID-19. One could ask at this point, is there something that protects young South Asians? And certainly the answer lies in the word young. We are a younger population than on average the US and even Brazil. That's one reason why we might be protected from mortality in terms of the disease. The question is, are there additional factors that come in that might be somehow protective of South Asian populations vis-a-vis other populations? A little more about history. And by the 20th of February, the World Health Organization risk assessment was to very high on the global level. The names were named. By the 11th of March in India, there were guidelines for mask use, guidelines for home quarantine. A notified disaster was declared on the 14th of March. And now all of you will remember this history from now on. On the 22nd of March, rail travel was suspended. There was a Janata curfew. On the 25th of March, on the midnight of 24th, 25th, the national lockdown began. Here's a picture of the Delhi-Gurugram border on the December 19th. That's the top left. And if there was ever hell on earth, this is probably it, to be caught in traffic of that sort at 6 p.m. in the evening. This is roughly the same location nearby on the 13th of May, well into the lockdown. You can see what difference it makes between then and now in terms of the way our environment has changed between that period and this period. Here are some of the images that surrounded the lockdown. And these are images of people, of large populations of migrant laborers working in Bombay, working in Delhi, working in Ahmedabad, far away from their original homes, having lost their work, having their factories having been closed. First of all, having been confined for long periods of time and not allowed to travel. And then when they had to travel back, facing the absence of transportation, it would take them these long distances. So they walked, in some cases, many hundreds, even thousands of kilometers back home. And these are some of the images from that time of these people. This is the India picture again, and we're going to go into this in a little more detail. So the lines that you see, the vertical lines, lockdown 1, lockdown 2, lockdown 3, lockdown 4, and the 3 phases of unlock that have happened after that. A couple of things. You can see that the Indian case numbers kept increasing gradually, even though if you remember the earlier graphs, they're not increasing as fast as the cases in the US certainly, or Brazil, or in fact most other countries. We tend to have started very low and then slowly increased, slowly but steadily increased. And this is the point where, so if you look at this, it doesn't look as though the lockdowns made much difference in terms of a dipping, but it certainly seems to have slowed down the overall progress of the disease, and that one could consider a positive. Now one can see a peak here, and then one can see, as I said, as this line did, the peak probably happened around the 15th of September. And as I said, we're about 4 to 5 weeks away from that point. And the issues are, is this a real peak? Are we counting all the cases? Are we counting all the deaths? To what extent can we be sure that we have turned a corner in some sense in terms of the pandemic. This is what different cities look like. This is Delhi on the top left, Pune in the top middle, Bangalore on the top right, and Mumbai, Chennai, and Kolkata below. The one thing that you can take away from this is that no two cities in India are equivalent. Delhi saw a nice two-peak structure. Pune saw a peak and then a second peak. And in all of these examples, the second peak, except for the case of Chennai, has been larger, typically, than the first peak. So classic two peaks in Delhi. In Mumbai, it's been kind of a peak and a gradual decline and then a subsequent climb a little later. Pune is now seeing a drop in the number of cases after seeing a sharp increase earlier. There doesn't seem to be any message that could be common across these different cities. Here's the picture that's a little more difficult to focus on. There's a lot of information on this slide. So the best thing to do is just to sort of look at it a little bit out of focus. This is for different states. So India is on the top left, Maharashtra, Madhya Pradesh, UP, Kerala, etc., etc. Again, just sort of look at the gestalt of this image and you will see that there is, again, no single bit of information that seems to be common to all of these things. You see a peak in some states, see a second peak in some states, you see what is one peak and a gradual decrease, you see one peak and a sharp decrease in some particular cases, in the case of the curves at the bottom, for example. So all of this is suggesting that we should try to understand each state, presumably even each city within that state separately, because there is no common general argument that applies to all of them. So the first question, since we looked at the picture of the lockdown, the first question is, did the lockdown help? And here is a slide, a piece of a slide that was published a few days ago from the National Supermodel for COVID-19 that says that very large numbers were actually saved by the lockdown. Unfortunately, this analysis really doesn't hold up to scrutiny, and one can certainly doubt this very much. It's true overall, in a statistical sense, that locking down in the early stages of the spread of the virus is linked to a reduced excess death toll. So here are a bunch of countries plotted as a function of the estimated lockdown day infections per million on the x-axis and the total excess deaths per million on the y-axis. So further to the right, the more later you lock down after your first million infections. Further up, the more excess deaths that you have. And the line that you can see through these points, not a great line, but is roughly consistent with the fact that the later you lock down, the more deaths you will actually see. There are, of course, counterexamples, and one very strong counterexample is Peru. Peru had probably the most stringent lockdown in the world and for the longest time, but this seemed to have no impact on the growth of its cases. In fact, Peru had a very large mortality from COVID-19. And so this is a sort of counterexample to suggest that even if you lock down, even if you're strict about a lockdown, it's possible that that will have no effect on the case. And it's interesting to look at the social circumstances that surrounded Peru's behavior. So now I want to move on to telling you a little bit about other work that I do in the context of COVID. And this is just to illustrate modeling exercises and of what value they have when we think about COVID. So this is the cartoon that shows two cats scratching at the back of a chair. And since I have a couple of other projects I'm also excited about. So the two main projects that I want to tell you about is one is called InsiSim and the second is called BharatSim. And both of these represent work that I've been doing for the past 8 months, pretty much since COVID-19 entered India. So the questions that we would like to address are the following. Here is an example of the COVID cases in India, the way this goes up. And there is some statistical prediction that attaches to that from Rijo John of the CPPR in Kochi. And you can see that this number goes up. And this is, of course, for all India. And as you saw, city and state level behavior is certainly more complex. So the question that someone who's interested in the epidemiology of COVID-19 might want to ask is, you see the number, look at the number of cases now at this point, and then look at it a little later, and look at it a little later, and a little later. At some earlier point in the pandemic, how do you know where that peak is going to come? How do you know what's going to happen to the rest of that peak? All of this is important because you need to be able to plan for what might happen in the future. You need to put hospital infrastructure in place. You need to put oxygen cylinders in place and able to access and just able to figure out how many doctors you need to treat the number of patients that you will actually expect. So that's the reason why one would like to predict things in advance of what they happen. And all of us think about the future, think about next week, think about a month from now, think about a year from now. In that context, we make models, mental models for what might be happening. These are similar to those mental models, but they add a layer of mathematics on top of them so that we can ask about numbers themselves. What is the number that we might expect in a particular region or a particular part of the world. The Indian government's relationship with modeling is a little bit schizophrenic, and there have been statements from top-level government officials that no model has forecast COVID spread correctly. And Indu Bhushan said the conclusion from mathematical modeling can create confusion and panic among citizens, etc. However, I think most people recognize the need to understand what might unfold in the future and what is it that governments ought to be doing to plan for that. So I first want to tell you a little bit about some work that was spawned under the aegis of the Indian Scientists' Response to COVID-19. This is a group of about 700 scientists from all over India, including several from outside India as well. And there is a modeling group of about 9 scientists associated with this Indian Scientists' Response to COVID-19, which does many other things. It does a lot of popular outreach, a lot of explaining, a lot of webinars that relate to COVID-19. But the modeling group put out a bunch of projections for COVID-19 in India based on a model that it had created and customized to the Indian situation. So the first ingredient of such models is to try and understand what might be the trajectory of a typical patient who's infected. So typically you start off being susceptible to the disease, you come into contact with someone who's infected with the disease and they infect you in turn, and then multiple things can happen. You can be asymptomatically infected, which means that you may not know, you may show very, very mild symptoms for a very brief period of the time, but it's possible that you remain infectious to other people. And after some time, you will recover. These diseases are self-limiting. If you don't die, you will recover at some further point. You could be mildly ill, that is to say you could exhibit some symptoms, but you might not need hospitalization. You could be severely or critically ill, in which case you might need hospitalization. You will exhibit severe symptoms, you might need an ICU, and in some small fraction of those cases, you might even die. And what we know better and better now is exactly the time that you spend being severely or mildly infected, the probability that you will die, the probability that you will recover from a severe infection. All of this we now know to some extent, and all of this feeds into the model that we're thinking about. This picture here, I don't expect you to take anything away from it, apart from the fact that it looks complicated. This is what an epidemiological model looks like, reduced to a little pictorial terms. You can take a picture like this and convert it into a set of equations, and that will answer questions for you like how many people, if 10 people are infected now, 3 weeks from now, how many people do you expect might die? How many people do you expect in the ICU, etc., etc. So there is a dashboard that accompanies the calculation that we did, and I encourage you to go and check it out. It's at this particular website on the University of Pune. And this is, you can enter numbers for your particular state. Right now, it's only state level in this particular dashboard, and examine the progress depending upon your initial choices of parameters, where the peak might happen, how many people might require hospitalization, and all of this. So the model was initially for states. A model that we will be putting out shortly brings all of the districts of India in the 738 districts odd of India. It's an age-structured model, so it includes the fact that people who are older are more likely to fall seriously ill than people who are younger. It accounts for the contacts between people, so young people mainly interact with younger people, older people with older people, but they all seem to interact with people in the 30 to 50 age group more or less similarly. We need to put that information in based on what we understand about such contact structures in India. We need to allow migration, the movement of people from one part of India to another part of India. We can also put in more complicated issues such as healthcare accessibility. How far do you have to go from in one part of India, in a certain district of India, to access good quality healthcare, such as a hospital? Here's some examples of what it is that we can do. So here is the forecast that we've been doing for Pune city for a while. That little band, the colored band that you can see, is band that we have forecast to be a reasonable band to hold the number of critical active. These are the cases that will require hospitalization. And you can see that the data, which are these dots, pretty much stay within that band. We had a best case and a worst case, and we looked at the variation of all of these parameters as you put in the lockdowns of various types, etc. You can see at some point the data move out to the band and then suddenly switch back in. And that was a point where the Pune administration discovered that more people were hospitalized than actually needed to be. So they requested them to go back home and to self-quarantine at home. And then the numbers of people who really required hospitalization came back into the band that we were predicting, and the location of the peak that we were predicting is more or less accurate. Here is work that we do for Karnataka. This is part of work done with two professors at IISc Bangalore and ISI in Bangalore. And this is for Chikmagalur district. We look at the number of cases and we attempt to predict a week in advance where these cases will actually go. This is some work that we did for Delhi, and you can see that we predicted a peak for Delhi around the middle of July. And we said that if you relax your vigilance post the end of the peak, if people are allowed to go out after this, then you might anticipate a further rise in cases. And we looked at different scenarios in which you saw the peak come down. And by the 1st of August, you had relaxed your precautions sufficiently that people began to reinfect each other again. Infected people began to infect susceptible people. And then you can see that go up again. And you can see the same picture at the bottom, which is the actual number of cases. You see the initial peak and then the subsequent second peak. Again, more or less as we had worried about when we explored this consequence of the model. I will tell you a little bit about work that we've done that is still incomplete, more because I want to illustrate a point about how one thinks about models and what it is that they can do. And that's about the importance of testing and how one can model testing. So the first point is look at the difference between South Korea and Italy in terms of testing. So South Korea launched a huge testing initiative before the first major cluster of infection, whereas Italy's testing expanded only after thousands of deaths had started. So Korea was doing about 1,000 tests per day before even its 100th confirmed case. And you can see the daily cases are the little yellow parts that you can see, and the line there is the amount of testing that you can see. And you can see that Korea was testing far more than it needed to, and therefore the number of cases, it managed to count cases, pull them out of the population, confine them so they couldn't infect anyone else, and this had an effect on the number of cases overall, which was not true for Italy. When you think about models of testing, the question that is really paramount at the moment is exactly what's happening in most parts of North India as well as in South India. There is a mix of tests. One has a middling accuracy test, typically called an RAT test or a rapid antigen test, which is inexpensive, and a high accuracy test, the RT-PCR test, which is costly. Governments must make economic decisions as to how to compare what mix of these tests to actually use in order to achieve a certain public health objective, because it's much more expensive to order to give people only the high accuracy test, even though the Tamil Nadu government does that. And all states cannot do that. They have to decide what is the right mix to do and look at the trade-offs that enter this particular question. Here's the model that we worked on that incorporates some of this. One has homes, one has people at homes. These people move to workplaces during the day and they come back to home at night. Some people who are infected then move to hospital, infect healthcare workers at the hospital. So you have these networks of interaction between people. There's a network at home, there's a network at work, there's a network in the hospital. And these networks are dynamic. If someone goes to hospital, they encounter the hospital network. Within workspaces, they encounter the work network. And we want to put some of this complexity in terms of the network description, then ask, this is a little more like real life compared certainly to the model that we were doing earlier. Can we ask about the implications of testing under such a scenario? So here's one typical example. If you test 1% of the population every day or 5% of the population every day as a fraction of the number of RAT tests and as a function of the sensitivity of the test, what's the right ballpark in which you can achieve a certain objective? Can I achieve with 0.5%, with 50% RATs, what I can achieve with 70% RATs? What's the point at which I have to make my trade-offs here? And this is the sort of calculation that will illuminate that particular issue. Now, the last sort of thing that I want to tell you about my own work is about BharatSim. And this is an interesting project that I've been working on for the past several months. BharatSim is an agent-based model. And an agent-based model is a very unique and special beast. In these models, you simulate individuals on their own, and you imagine them in some sort of geographical location, some interaction between them, exactly as in the network model that I showed you. You imagine that they have homes, they go to work, they come back, they take public transport. So the heart of these descriptions is that you model individuals and how they transmit disease to one another. So BharatSim is an ultra-large-scale simulation of agents. By ultra-large-scale, and we'd like to simulate at some level the whole of India's population. That may be too big an ask to do on any sort of regular computer. So most probably we'll confine ourselves to looking at regions, at parts of cities, at whole cities, maybe even states. But in principle, we'd like to have the ability to have both the data and the simulational sort of the chops to do the whole of the country. In order to define an agent and the properties of the agent, you need to think about a synthetic population for these agents and derive these agent properties from a synthetic or imagined population. The synthetic population, I will tell you a little bit about it as we go along, but we need to represent both India's peoples as well as parts of its geography. This is a collaboration between the university I work in at the moment, Ashoka University, and a company called ThoughtWorks. The most immediate use of BharatSim is to model how COVID-19 spreads and to assess different strategies that you can use to mitigate its bad effects. The core of all of these models is that you have infected people and susceptible people, and infected people can infect susceptible people, and you can encode the properties of the disease in that interaction. But there are many other potential applications in other parts of public health, in social sciences and economics of having such a model. There are three essentials. You need a computational model to simulate these agents, these sort of fake people on a computer. You need networks to describe how these agents interact. And you need a synthetic population that encodes more information about these agents that are relevant to disease. So you hope to build this up from census data, from demographic data, from the National Family Health Survey data, as well as many others. So at its core, the whole business of creating a synthetic population of agents relies on integrating multiple databases and surveys together and having approximations for how people contact each other across different locations. Agents have attributes that are taken from the synthetic population. Some of them are relevant to disease and public health. For example, we may say an individual ID is male, they're 63 years old, this is the location of their house, this is the location of their work, this is the person who has a high school education, they earn less than 20,000 rupees per annum, they're some category of labor, etc. And then you might have to have information like they were infected on the 25th of June, they were quarantined on such and such a date, they recovered on some third date, etc. All of this information needs to be put inside. You need population information. You need to sort of tell people, you need to tell the computer where people are present in larger concentrations, larger densities than in others. So certainly demographic information about the population density of India will come into this particular model. When we talk about the synthetic population, I want just to look at this picture a little bit. It's just a picture of a man, just sort of concentrate on his face a little bit. And what we'd like to do is to build up a synthetic population of individuals who we imagine look like real people, are real people. I will tell you about the website from which this picture is taken. And the website is called thispersondoesnotexist.com. And this is actually a fake person. This is a person whose attributes, whose picture has been generated using machine learning and artificial intelligence techniques that combine attributes of a large number of pictures to obtain something that is almost frighteningly realistic. This is what one would like to do with the synthetic population. You'd like to reproduce as far as possible the characteristics of the real population. What ideally you would like to do would be to make a certain predictions for what you might see in terms of demographic or social attributes in a particular region, and then have a survey go in and check, and the survey results should be as close on average to the results that you predict from your synthetic population as you can possibly make it. And to do that, one has to use fairly advanced techniques in computer science. And that's part of the fun of doing something that is very new as far as this is concerned. To make a synthetic population of India, as I said, one has to integrate multiple data sources for gender, age distribution, family sizes, socioeconomic data, healthcare access, etc., etc. Prior immunity is another biological variable that one could try and put into this if we had some idea of how that actually worked, if it worked at all for COVID-19. So the idea finally is that the Bharat Sim program and the synthetic population will be available freely for use by anyone once it's done. And this is at its core a community effort. It's intended so the community contributes to it, and it also can take back whatever it has put in and what everyone else is actually putting in. Let me come to a few final questions before I wrap up. The first is the question of mortality numbers and how many people are actually dying of COVID-19 in India. If you remember, there was this big gap between mortality in Brazil, in the US, compared to India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, Sri Lanka, and the other countries of South Asia. In many Latin American countries, you can actually look at this difference between sort of the baseline values of mortality and the increase that can presumably only be attributed to COVID-19. So what goes into this is some estimate of excess deaths. People will die anyway of natural causes or in traffic accidents, etc., throughout a particular period. What you want to do is to be able to account for that and then ask, are you seeing deaths in numbers that are larger than that? And if you have a disease that's moving through the population, the natural thing to do would be to attribute that to that particular disease in terms of the excess mortality caused by that disease. You can see that the numbers for Mexico, for Peru, for Ecuador, for Chile are all substantially higher than the actual number of COVID-19 deaths that were obtained through official statistics. If you look at what's happening in the US, there's a sort of interesting contrast. Many of the initial wave of US deaths happened in the big US cities, New York and the suburbs of New York. So at the peak, when the pandemic first hit, that was where the large number of deaths happened. Now, the deaths that you're seeing are in more rural, in smaller towns and more rural areas, and the pace of increase of those deaths has become slower. So certainly one aspect of that is that we do know how to treat COVID a little better. We do know what warning signs to watch out for. There's much clinical expertise that has developed over the past 8 or 9 months across the world in how one treats COVID-19 patients. We don't know, unfortunately, about the extent of undercounting in India. In most cases, the only information that exists is anecdotal. It involves journalists typically going to cremation ghats or to burial grounds to ask how many people are actually coming in, and you detect numbers that are larger than the numbers that are actually that the government is claiming. Or the government periodically readjusts its numbers to account for the fact that some deaths that ought to have been attributed to COVID were misattributed to something else. A reasonable guess is that in the major cities of India, the undercounting is probably by a factor of about 1.5 to 2, maybe even 3. Outside these cities, it's actually unclear because the nature of reporting and the nature of reporting of mortality figures is typically much worse once you move outside major cities compared to in major cities. So what do we learn? And I think this is the most important part of what I want to discuss this evening. First of all, a general point is that this quote from David Fisher says, you've got to remember that this was a novel virus and chaos is really normal at the beginning of an outbreak. So people who criticize one country or the other, or China or the WHO, etc., have to remember that they were working in a very fast evolving situation, trying to understand, trying not to panic people more than was absolutely necessary, and trying to understand what the clinical science and the epidemiological science was actually telling them. I have 2 quotes from the famous French Nobel Prize winner, Albert Camus, and the first, who wrote a book called The Plague. And he says, what's true of all the evils in the world is true of plague as well. It helps people to rise above themselves. And that's the first point that I want to concentrate on. The positives that I can see is that the messaging from the Prime Minister and the Cabinet have been on point on this. And that's very refreshing to see compared to other world leaders, such as, for example, Bolsonaro in Brazil, or Trump in the US, or Johnson in the UK, or Putin in Russia. Our Prime Minister and the Cabinet stressed the nature of the disease and the interventions and remained positive overall about what we were doing. And that's always a good thing in public leaders. The planning for health systems resources was by and large reasonable given the scale of the country. And people can argue about the by and large, it could have been better, it could have been worse, etc. So this mine is just a sort of overall comment about how it was, how much worse it could have been, and the fact that people pitched in very hard. And all of this involved the untold and unsung work of many, often under very trying conditions. Here are some of the negatives. The lockdown was hasty and insufficiently planned, particularly probably because of the lack of social science input to the decisions that went behind the lockdown. The approach there was much more technocratic. It was much more a question of how do we do this efficiently? Where do we move people from to where? At what speed do we shut down factories, etc., etc. It didn't look really at the nature of the problems that might arise, especially with migrant labor and their need to go back after they'd lost their source of livelihood. Other communications, apart from these sort of diktats from the top, was fairly terrible. No Indian epidemiologist really came to the forefront to explain to the people what was going on. There's no analog of Tony Fauci in India. Overall, especially in more recent months, there's been some sense of fear, inability to honestly criticize policy, although this is certainly Indians are argumentative a lot, and there's a lot of criticism. But it has been somewhat muted among people who one might expect would have the knowledge to be able to criticize. But there's been a sense of community among scientists, especially, and many others, and a lot of hard work collectively towards a cause, which is to deal with COVID-19. So the Indian scientists' response to COVID-19, as I said before, is one such spontaneously organized organization that came together and worked very hard, had a whole bunch of people, not just scientists, visual artists, public science communicators, doctors, who came together to try and understand what it was that a collective response to telling people about the disease, telling them how to cope with it, could actually accomplish. Along with this, there is also COVID Gyan, which is a more institutional response, backed by the Indian Institute of Science, the Department of Atomic Energy. A whole bunch of Bangalore-based institutions are at the core of this effort, doing very similar work and very nice work in communicating to the public more about the disease. And there are many other initiatives all around the countries, across IITs, etc., which I'm not even going to try to name. These are some slides from my earlier talk. So let me just remind you of the prior epidemic. So this is 1918 to 1919. So now pretty much a century and a year behind us. You can see the large numbers of people in large communal wards in this particular picture. Remember that this disease infected 500 million people, 25% of the world's population at that time, and 30 to 50 million people died. In India, India was the hardest struck of all of the countries in the world. 5 to 10% of the Indian population died as a consequence of Spanish flu. That's 1 out of 10 people. So it killed overall about 2.5% of its victims. And normally you don't think of influenza as doing that, but this came at the end of a very bruising world war. And medical care was much cruder then. There were many deaths that happened as a consequence. It's also possible that the ways of treating the disease at that point was responsible for some level of deaths as well. I use that example because I want to draw a line between from there to sort of sequence of potential pandemics that we saw in this century. There was SARS, which luckily didn't spread very much between 2002 2003, H1N1 2009, which is a close relative of Spanish flu, MERS in 2012, which is really Middle Eastern, centered around Saudi Arabia, a little peak around South Korea, but still sort of remains in the background. It's still there at the level of a few hundred cases per year. Ebola, of course, 76, 2013, all the way up to 2019. Again, a very dreaded disease, but not geographically expanded beyond the countries of a subset of countries in the western parts of Africa. And there's SARS-CoV-2. And the line goes on to say that this isn't the end of it. We have a history in the past, and we will have a history in the future. This is something I'm not an expert on, the economic fallout of COVID-19, but this is certainly something that's going to affect all countries around the world. And there's a general statement that's made that says that countries that were unable to control their outbreaks have tended to suffer the most economic pain. So India has seen relatively small number of deaths per million, but has seen a fairly large fall in the GDP. So I'm not sure what information to actually extract from data like this, except that some Asian countries did well, both in reducing the number of deaths as well as making sure that they were not economically very hard hit. Vietnam and China being among them. The UK and Spain did badly on all counts. They did badly in terms of cumulative deaths per million, as well as in terms of the fall in their GDP. What have we learnt about what to do? So again, we now understand much more than we understood then. At that time, on the 20th of February, we did think that an important mode by which the disease was transported was merely through physical contact, through surfaces, and through people who violently expelled it through sneezing, expelling large numbers of droplets, etc., etc. Now we realize that the disease is a little more insidious. It can spread even if you have someone who breathes outside. And that's really a question of droplet size. When you breathe, the droplets that you typically emit are very, very small. If you cough, the droplets that you emit are somewhat larger. And it was usually assumed that the larger droplets would try to fall down or would evaporate, but the smaller droplets, you needn't really have worried about the droplets. But that's one piece of understanding that has improved in the last few months. We now understand that just ordinary exhalation, being in a confined space, being in a space that is not sufficiently airy, doesn't have air flowing through it, is all bad in terms of people who might contract the disease from someone who's infected in their vicinity. So we now think of protection against the disease as in terms of a Swiss cheese model. And Swiss cheeses are these slices of cheese with holes in them. And you can imagine a whole bunch of different slices of cheese. So one slice might represent cloth masks, which help to cut out some of the virus, but not all of it. Then social distancing, which reduces again the amount of virus. Cleaning and disinfecting, which reduces further the amount of virus. And hand washing, which is a further upstream thing that you could do. And all of these are not perfect on their own. So if you only did distancing, if you only did cloth masks, if you only did disinfecting, you would wind up with a larger amount of virus than if you did all of these together. And you can expand upon this to have physical distancing, ventilation, various types of hand hygiene, fast testing, contact tracing, etc., etc. All of these are public health measures by which you can hope that finally a human being in the presence of a virus, in the presence of infected people, is protected through these multiple layers of Swiss cheese. And even though each of these layers might individually have holes in them, might allow for the passage of virus, together they add up to stronger protection than any one of them alone. So all of the work that I told you is work done with a whole bunch of people across the country. There's a large group of people, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 people, and then myself, who've been working on the insights model that I told you about, the model that we use to predict behavior in Pune and other cities of India, with Sandeep Krishna and Philip Cherian. So I'm not going to name all of them, their names are all up there. With Krishna and Cherian, I've been working on the testing problem that I told you about. Debayan Gupta has been a collaborator who's been working on the Bharat project and has been very crucially involved in that project. A whole bunch of wonderful people at ThoughtWorks who've been working on the Bharat agent-based simulation. This is supported by the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. And Rajesh Sundaresh and Sivatre at ISI have been collaborating with us on the Karnataka work. So we supply the data that they then use to make various predictions and use them in other work that they're doing for the Karnataka state. So let me finish with this line, again a line from Kumu saying about the plague, it says it will go unaccountably when it pleases, and one day others will emerge. And that's really the sort of paradoxical question here, that after COVID-19, it's not as though there are not going to be other pandemics, but hopefully our experience with COVID-19 will help us tackle them better, help us look out for them better, and be able to look out for the public health of our populations at large in a better way, because we understand COVID-19 so much more now. Before we ever even thought about it or even thought that something like this could happen, a pandemic could actually sweep across the world. So let me thank you at this point. Let me go back to not presenting anymore. And I'm happy to take questions from all of you.
Thanks a lot, Gautam. That was a panoramic discussion that you offered us just now. And I also realized that the skies have darkened since the time you started. So you can see there's hardly any light on my face. I encourage those who have listened to the talk can ask questions in the comments box that you will see, and we'll pass the questions on to Gautam. Until we have those questions, I have a couple of questions for Gautam. Gautam, I remember reading an interview done by Ashoka University with you, where you categorically state that correlations between socio-economic variables like class, gender, etc., are impossible to do. We're all in it together. And I'm quoting you now. Would you say that even now, after having seen data since then? I mean, or can you make rough sort of correlations between probability?
So what I think what I meant then was that all of us are at equal probability of being infected if there's someone near us who carries that infection. There's nothing so that's something to remember. But it's also true that many of us are able to insulate ourselves from external circumstances better than others. And certainly in cities like Bombay, you look at if you look at the number of people who've been infected by the disease, that differs very vastly between the slums and between the more the upmarket, the more expensive areas of the city. That's a straightforward example of how socioeconomic circumstances can influence the progress of the disease. The better off you are, the more able you are to control the circumstances around you and to ensure that you're not in particularly crowded areas. This is also true in the US, it's also true in the UK, where the brunt of the pandemic has fallen on people, on typically Black communities, Asian communities, minority communities, who don't have the wherewithal, and compared to the general population, to be able to insulate themselves sufficiently. So now certainly socioeconomic circumstances is important to determining whether you will get the disease or not. But to sort of, to disentangle, there's a broad reason, which is that you cannot control your circumstances around you. You cannot confine yourself from other people well enough. Whether there are further distinctions to be made isn't very clear to me at this point.
We have, oddly, the comment section was showing a blank, but when I clicked on it, I see there are dozens of comments and questions. While I, quickly go through them and raise one, can I have one for you in the meantime,
Sure.
Gautam? It's, two questions really. One was, I think, something very, you said it in passing, but I thought it was an important evaluation on your part, where you were dismissing a claim made by someone that were it not for the lockdown, the incidence of infections would have been higher. And you said there was nothing to back that claim. I'm just wondering, after so many months with the sort of cases we have seen, many are asking if the lockdown was necessary to be implemented in the fashion it was. And I remember you in an interview where you spoke about a staggered workforce entry as one way in which you could handle the post-lockdown economic recovery sort of measures. Could that have been done from the start? This is, I suppose, may not serve any particular policy point right now, but just in a way of thinking about how else could India have managed this problem?
So that's particularly hard to answer. And in a sense, it depends upon what you think a priori about what we should have done and what we shouldn't have done. If you were to ask me, I think the first lockdown really helped to slow down the progression of of cases. Whether the second, third, etc. lockdowns could have been handled in a different manner is, of course, open. The question of were lives saved or not saved is very much a question that depends upon the model that you use. And the model that we used, we came out saying that, look, our numbers are far more conservative. If anything, we have something like between 8,000 and 30,000 lives that were, in quotes, saved by the measures, by the lockdown measures, when other models were having numbers like 1.5 lakhs. So we said that, look, we do believe that some lives were saved as a consequence of the lockdown in a very limited sense, saying that if you had it or you didn't have it and you made certain assumptions about how the disease would grow, then this is the saving that you would actually make. But there are a bunch of points to be sort of added to that. The question is, how long do you continue to save these lives? Because it's clearly understood for many years that a lockdown will only delays the progression of the disease. If you sort of lock down for a while, you see the disease number comes down. But if you have any people who carry the infection left at the end of the lockdown, they will give you a further rise, and the numbers will rise up to values that they had in the absence. This has been known for a long time. So what you need to do is to, during the lockdown period, be as proactive as possible in reducing, in isolating cases, making sure that they're confined in the population, of quarantining them, and ensuring that they don't pass the disease on to other people. So both of these things have to go together to make any sense. And of course, all of these don't count other costs. They don't count the costs of migrant labor moving large distances back to their homes. They don't count deaths that come from inability to access food or other types of support or medical support during that period. This is a very complex calculation. It is not a simple one. And if we had a better idea of sort of background levels of mortality, or what you could ask, what are the excess deaths that happened during that period that might have been attributed to the lockdown, but this is somewhat difficult to do. And I've seen no convincing measure really of lives saved by lockdown. I would tend to think that, look, in a sort of mechanical sense, you can say a certain number of lives were saved. There's certainly any reasonable estimate is smaller than the more outlandish estimates that we've seen. But if you add everything up, it's not clear that there was a net saving. So I think that's the only reasonable way to say it. Can't hear you. Does geography of a region, so shall I answer these questions as they are?
Yes.
Yeah, does the geography of region affect the behavior of the virus? I don't think there's any real evidence for strong correlations with temperature, humidity, etc., that might be significant. For example, I mean, Brazil, a lot of Brazil and India are kind of in the same climatic regions. So I don't think that affects things very much, not as far as we know. So geography, probably not. Climate, probably not. Humidity and rain, probably not. There may be subtle effects, but nothing really striking that you can see immediately. How real is the current decline and how can it be explained? That's a good question. So that's the question that I've been answering to various people for the last week or so, last week to 2 weeks. I think the current decline is real. And there are a lot of caveats around that statement, but I suspect it can be explained by the fact that the disease has pretty much exhausted itself in the major metros of India. And if you look at Delhi, Bombay, Bangalore, Hyderabad, Chennai, etc., even possibly parts of Calcutta, you already have more than 40 to 50% of people infected in these regions. Maybe somewhere 30 to 40, let's say. Under such circumstances, it's harder for people who are infected to find people who are susceptible in the population. So that's typically the point where you will see some sort of turning down in this, depending upon what your estimate of that number is. I think in the cities, for the time being, the pandemic has, in the local regions where lots of people have been infected, has kind of exhausted itself. So now the action will shift to the more remote regions, the more rural regions of India, and the tier 2, tier 3, tier 4 cities across the country. Over there, because reporting is not of the same quality as you might expect in the cities, it is possible to lose track of the numbers a little bit. These numbers may be growing, but you can't quite sense that rate of growth. I would err on the side of thinking that it is probably real. There's been a sustained decrease in that number overall for the last 5 weeks. We are not seeing increases, sort of strong increases in numbers in states like UP and Bihar, which really would be points of concern because they are very large states, and potentially the consequences of an infection spreading in them would be quite strong. So I think at this point we can be hopeful. One thing to watch out for is what's going to happen in the festival season, and there that might lead to a further sort of uptick in the number of cases, and then potentially a second wave as more people get infected who are not infected in the first round. There's still a way to go. There's still more people to be infected. That's the real bottom line. So if you're not careful, those people will wind up being infected and the number of cases will rise again. But I suspect that for the time being, the action will not be in the major cities. It will be outside. Are we testing enough? How much is enough, do you think? RAT, PCR, how are we doing on that front? We are testing currently around 0.1% of the population per day. We're testing a little less than that, maybe 0.05 to 0.06% of the population. We're testing about like 10 million at this point. All of the work that we're doing with testing suggests that you need to be testing more than that. You need to be testing possibly around at least half to 1% of the population. The one sort of very preliminary thing that we can say is that you can actually get fairly far with RATs. And it doesn't have to be all PCR. This again relies on assumptions about the accuracy, about the sensitivity of the RAT test. States like UP, we're not quite sure in some states about what the mix is, but typically this seems to be currently maybe about 70% to 80% RAT versus the rest PCR. Tamil Nadu, as I said, has been doing consistently only PCR tests. And so at least on the basis of modeling exercises with not completely unreasonable numbers, it seems as though one can get somewhere with a reasonable mix, maybe 50-50, 60-40, etc., of RAT and PCR, without really having a problem, provided you test at higher levels than you're doing now. So low testing plus a combination of tests is probably a bad idea. How do different strains of a virus affect these testing models? Two or more strains in the same area. I think so these tests are typically sensitive to a part of the virus that doesn't change much between strains, typically to the spike protein of the virus. So I would imagine that the difference between strains is probably equivalent between tests. That shouldn't make much of a difference. I'm not a person, so when can I expect a vaccine? I'm not a vaccine expert, but from what I read, I think, with some luck, probably early next year. The rollout in India, it's hard to say, but I'm guessing that it'll probably be a good way into next year before something even remotely reaches our shores. But that's just a guess at this point, based on what I understand from other people. I'm not an expert on that question. Early lockdown, Argentina exponents are going down. Is there any expression other than the political one? I think so let me take the example of Kerala, which again seems to sort of do everything right. It was extolled in the media, etc. But then after keeping its numbers down, its mortality down for quite a while, it's currently seeing an explosion in the cases. Been seeing it for the past several weeks. There is also an element of chance in this, and that's very important to convey. And someone who does simulations of disease spread knows this very well. That there are times when your simulation will sort of suddenly die out and everyone will be fine and recovered after that. And there will be times where it suddenly speeds up. And this is just, in a sense, chance. These are mainly driven by chance events that are then amplified. And beyond the point, it goes beyond chance because it just reached too many people. And then the logic of how an epidemic grows, a classical epidemic grows, begins to take over. So I don't know what the real answer is. What was the nature of the lockdown? How strict was the lockdown? Where were the cases coming from? And what are the contacts of the people who were infected? There may be sort of more technically, very much more local details that should go into addressing that particular question. There is no general, I don't think there's a very general statement that one can make about why it didn't take off in one place and not in the other. That would be a mystery. For example, it's UP. Why is it that UP, the most populous state in India, and among, if it was, it's with at a population of 220, it's among the top 10 subnational units in the world. Why is it that the numbers there have not sort of reached larger proportion than we've seen yet? So some of this may just be accident, some of this may just be bad reporting. It's hard at this point to tell which is which. hygiene theatre done in the country, does large-scale sanitation of roads or public transport help? Sanitation of roads, probably not, would be my guess. And for public transport, certainly surfaces that people touch ought to be regularly sanitized. For example, the rails that are on top of buses, the sides of windows, etc. It's good practice to keep all of them regularly sanitized, because we do know that that is one way in which a virus can transfer from person to person, through what are called fomites. The more we've come to a slight reassessment of the role of such transmission of virus between people vis-a-vis respiratory transmission. And it's seen that the respiratory route, by just inhaling droplets, is more important than just picking it up in your hand and then later wiping it over your nose. And so the balance of our knowledge of which is important versus the other has changed a little bit, but that doesn't rule out or doesn't say that we should not be mindful of the fact that we can get this virus from other sources, from surfaces, etc. So I think surfaces that people touch, doorknobs, any public surface, needs to be cleaned at regular intervals. There's no way out of that. So I wouldn't call that particular part of a theatre. So, hosing down roads, etc., is really overkill. That doesn't make sense. Synthetic population for India, how robust are these? Wouldn't that robustness affect the model? The answer is that this is all in the process of being developed. And as time goes on, we can expect better and better synthetic populations. At some level, the ones that we have now are crude. They're improving constantly. And they will need help from people all over to contribute little parts of it, of their understanding to it, contribute little surveys so that we know little bits about this pocket versus this pocket with this versus some other pocket. So our challenge is to be able to integrate all of these different sources of information into the machine learning approaches that we have to construct the synthetic population. That's something that we're very interested in at this point. Is there an understanding of reinfection by the virus? Very good question. And the answer would probably be no. This is a coronavirus, and there are other coronaviruses that cause something like the common cold, and they reinfect you. You can, having got it now, you can get it a year later. So you might sort of think that, look, being of the same class of viruses, presumably something here should also apply. We haven't seen a large increase in reinfections, although the people have been looking out for it. So at this point, it's really not possible to say whether that's going to be significant in the future or not. How long does your immunity last, and what is the nature of that immunity? We still don't know yet. That's a very, very important question. Viruses always mutate. Viruses mutate all the time. This is an RNA virus, so ought to be mutating faster, but it has what's called a proofreading mechanism in it that ensures that it doesn't mutate all that fast. So while it's mutating, it doesn't matter. It can mutate as long as it doesn't mutate to something that is more virulent than the current version that it has. So mutations are expected. They kept very careful track of. There are websites where you can go and see in each particular region, depending upon the sequences that have been reported, what the mutations are, what's known about it. What we need to understand a little better is the correlation of the mutation with the clinical consequences of that. And that's something that needs both clinicians, doctors, as well as epidemiologists and people who do sequencing, biologists who do sequencing, to come together and understand this data together. What are the learnings from previous pandemics that India has fought in its fight against the COVID virus? I think the fact that we have a National Center for Disease Control, the fact that we have some level of epidemiology in the country that is targeted at gathering data about potential infection that could balloon outward and become pandemics, is all a consequence of the fact that we have been thinking. We have a very strong immunization program, a polio immunization program. It's something that will stand us in good stead when it comes to vaccinating a large fraction of our population. So we do have strengths. Our past history in public health will certainly help us in the future. And COVID-19 is an unusual beast in many points of view. The fact that people can transmit infections to other people without showing symptoms, without they themselves being aware that they're infected, is really a very unusual feature of COVID-19 that every country, including India, is wrestling with. So the means, the necessity for masking, distancing, etc., as well as for quarantine and isolation, is something that is fairly specific to these types of diseases. Changes in the behavior of populations over time. So that you can put into an agent-based model. And in fact, with some effort, you can put it into the other models as well. That finally, the ability of someone to infect someone else is a function of how they socially interact, the networks of social interactions. And by social, I also mean physical interactions between people. And these can evolve in time. So that information can certainly be put into these models. Yes. What makes it so good at spreading? It's a respiratory disease. So people have to breathe. Basically, they have to breathe. People will cough, and once that, you have a spread of virus in the form of droplets in the air, and someone else can ingest those droplets. So the fact that it's a respiratory disease, not a disease that is spread by close physical contact, for example, for example Ebola, which is sort of difficult to transfer because you do need a transfer of bodily fluids from one person to the other, typically when they come into contact. But respiratory disease transmit very easily and very fast between people. So that's really the reason why one should be watchful, why COVID-19 is special.
Thanks a lot, Gautam. If you have more questions in the comments box, but I have one. We have 10 more minutes, 15 more minutes for this session to be complete. Um, you know, everyone knows that the way the government seems to be going about collecting data and as well as using it or making it public, there are problems there, and you yourself talked about why that ought not have been the case. But given that you're modeling and with the data that somehow you seem to think is reliable, how do you work in an atmosphere of data uncertainty? How do you manage uncertainty in your work?
So that's a hard question. I mean, we have to take what we're given at this point. Whatever pressure one can put in, whichever way one can put on government to say that it's in everybody's interest if this information, if the data is clean and available publicly, rather than confined to the government's medical research organization. This is better for everybody because there is more expertise outside, for example, the ICMR to look at data, and we're all in this together. There are ways of dealing with uncertainty. There are sort of mathematical methods, probabilistic methods like Bayesian analysis that can incorporate levels of uncertainty about numbers that you can put into your analysis, and this gives you broad error bars on anything that you might predict. We use some of these techniques in what we do. We sort of try and understand if there's a certain number of cases that you're observing, what is the number of cases that you're not observing? And can you look at the number of deaths, which potentially you cannot exaggerate by a factor of 10 or 100, and use that together with the number of detected cases to figure out how many cases are you not detecting. So a lot of this is a little bit of detective work in asking how does this number behave versus this number versus some other number versus something else that you get versus the results of a serological survey, etc., etc. So it's, as I said, it's detective work putting things together, but one can actually, although it's difficult, one can make some progress. The long-term consequences. Yeah, I have a question. Should I take that?
Yes. Okay. Can you hear me, Gautam?
I can hear you. I can hear you.
The Bharat Sim project that you mentioned at the very end of your talk, which you termed a community effort, which invites people to contribute data, about mortality and other things. I mean, how would you authenticate entries being made on a large scale?
So we haven't sort of reached that point yet. Right now, we'll take entries from people who we know and trust in data that is published or available in some public form for us. The one question is how do you anonymize that data? Because the data that is, for example, data that is taken from a certain, so we certainly don't want to look at it. We would like to extract information from it without having any connection or relation to the people, in fact, from which it was taken, as is required when the standard privacy requirements under ethics. The way in which that ought to be done is something that we're still trying to work out, but that is certainly something that we'd like to do. And and the question of how people can contribute to this effort, how we can involve them in this, is something we're still trying to understand. So right now we're just working with public databases and trying to correlate them and put them together.
There was a question that appeared on this. Okay, this is one.
That's a great question, and this is something that is worrying lots and lots of people. And I sort of made a bit light to the fact that if you're young, you're typically there will be no problem, etc., for you. But it's certainly true that some fraction of young can actually have fairly severe versions of the disease, and people who recover from the disease after 2 to 3 weeks some fraction of them do carry long-term consequences. You can have serious heart disease as a consequence of being infected by COVID-19. You can have neurological consequences. You can have kidney damage. And things are being these are called long haul or long COVID patients. We don't know enough about them, especially in India. So I think there is some need for a registry of patients who've had COVID and who have seen long-term symptoms to see how they relate to patients outside the country and whether there is some commonality between what one sees in India. Maybe there is a registry that I don't know about, but there certainly ought to be one if there isn't, so that we can track individual patients to find out what these long-term consequences are. So this is one of the big question marks. It's known that for some fraction of people, there will be long-term serious consequences. We don't know how big that fraction is. And we need to know more about the exact consequences that it might have clinically.
There's another question which will appear on your screen in a second.
Is your network planning any kind of community survey to assess deaths? No. So right now we are not particularly told to do surveys on our own. This is something that I've thought about, but haven't. I mean, right now we don't have the infrastructure or the abilities to do that. So we hope other people will do it and will tell us what they find, so that we have some idea of what the discrepancy is.
In your talk, you mentioned, or you regretted, the non-invitation to social scientists and epidemiologists in the way policy was being planned. Does the situation seem to show any signs of change in this regard?
So I'm not sort of privy to sort of deep thinking inside at the government level. So I don't know who is involved and who is not involved. Although the initial committees that were constituted were all committees that were very, very largely government committees. They were heads of government institutions. There were a relatively small number of people from outside. So you could think of that. There were IAS officers, there were heads of national institutes of various types, all very eminent people. But I do think that there is expertise outside government that is significant, especially in these areas, and that it would have been useful to tap upon that before you made policy, as a general statement. I hope the government is doing that and is thinking along these lines. My worry is that the approach has been sort of technocratic so far. But this is the problem of disease is something that has many dimensions. It's not just a question of how do you move material from A to B, or how do you account for patients, for hospitals in size C. One has to worry about long-term, social, economic, all of these issues that come together with this. And I think that discussion is important to have.
There are two more questions. This was a follow-up on the previous question.
Yeah, I think that would be nice. Again, we are not planning to do that. That would be nice. I hope the million death study will have an additional questions that relate to trying to understand whether the person passed away with a COVID diagnosis or not. That would, again, very important information that will really tell us about excess deaths in ways that we don't have any way of assessing at the moment, especially outside the cities. Dementia, like recovering from COVID, how serious it? Again, we don't know. I've also read this, and I mean, COVID there seems to be large sort of very different types of symptoms in small fractions of the population. Kidney damage, heart damage, even dementia, like in sort of neural damage of various sorts. My impression is from sort of, at least from my reading, that I don't know. I don't know how serious it could be, but it seems to be that all of this is really a small fraction of the population that suffers severe disease. We don't know how big that fraction is.
So, Gautam, your team that you introduced us to at the end is made up mostly of scientists. And I recall you mentioning somewhere that you do need the involvement of the humanities and social scientists as well in this project. And are you, to the extent that you have control over bringing in, non-scientist minds into this thing? Have you taken any steps in that direction?
Oh yeah. So I talked to the health economists at my university, and also outside. I'm very, very open to talking to people who are in areas who are interested in this project. For example, sociologists would really be very important. I'd be very interested in social surveys that look at the network structure of human interaction. So in Bharat, the way it works is you sort of define a network at home, a network at work, etc. But so that's how many people do you contact in a day, who are there, and how close do you approach them physically? These, in a village setup, what is the networks that individuals have? What, depending upon their age, depending upon their seniority, depending upon the class to which they belong. These are questions that only very good social surveys can tell us about. And this is very vital to making good models. So I'm completely open and extremely interested in talking to people who would like to work on this with us.
We have two more questions.
In more effective vaccines in the future. Um, Again, complicated question. So the question that we're looking at is very simple. What are the levels of testing and the mix of tests that you need to use to achieve a certain amount of understanding of how the disease is progressing in your population and to be able to control that? One could, in principle, once BharatSim is up and running, ask these questions about targeting, because there you can put in different scenarios for how the disease might spread with vaccination, without vaccination, and choose the ones in which vaccination is the most efficient, or it gives you the most bang for your buck. So with good models, you can do that. And that's certainly what models are for. Models are really to be able to distinguish between different alternatives, doing something, not doing something, doing a combination of something else. And the more you trust your models, the more you benchmark them against things that you know, the more confident you can be that what they're predicting is something that is sensible. What should we do to tackle future pandemics? I think very broadly improve public health at multiple levels, but especially guaranteeing a high level of common public health services to everybody in the country, I think is one step. Universal public health. And there are many corollaries of that which I won't go into, and certainly reducing inequality is one of them. I think much more specifically to what I've been talking about and what I think about is more collaboration between government and people outside government. This is the sort of collaboration that exists, for example, in the US or in other countries where much of epidemiological modeling happens outside government. And there is a close interaction between people who gather data, people who do the modeling, people who do the analysis, multiple departments together. And then you have all of this information coming together and being systematized and synthesized into a common prediction that can be made from that information. Right now, we don't have that level of interaction between government modelers, government epidemiologists, government data, etc., and people from outside. And we do need many more people from outside. So we do need many more epidemiologists in the country. We do need much more training. We need more training in modeling. We need more people interested in this. That, I think, would prepare us better. We can never be truly well prepared, but at least somewhat better prepared than we are now, I think. That's from my limited point of view.
Gautam, I had a quick question. The idea of the Indian public and its relationship with science or a scientific rationality has been an important question that has been for the last 125 years or more. And but when you've observed the responses to this particular pandemic and the measures of the government to handle it, etc., I mean, have there been any uh, you know uh, lessons of whatever kind, social, cultural, moral kind, that you have been able to see that is different from what we've always known about?
That's a very hard question to answer. I mean, there's all sorts of wrong stuff that floats around on WhatsApp. And usually the rule should be that if you see anything on WhatsApp regarding COVID-19, don't believe it. And so the group that I work with, the Indian Scientific Response to COVID-19, it has done a lot of what is called hoax busting, and sort of going out and saying that you believe this, but it's wrong. You believe this is wrong. These are the things to follow, and so on. That's where I think scientists can be effective in communicating to the public why something should be done versus something else, why it will protect you to wear a mask, why it will protect you to behave in a certain way, etc., and to communicate the seriousness of the disease, the fact that you don't want to contract it at all, and that it makes sense to not to let down your vigilance. I think scientists should do much more. They should be much more in the public eye on issues such as this. And in a sense, I think that is a positive of COVID-19, that many scientists decided that they did have a certain responsibility in this regard to learn new things, learn about a new disease, and to communicate to the best of whatever they could, to use their training in fluid dynamics or engineering or physics or medicine to do something directed towards COVID-19, if only communicating about it and translating the scientific terms into terms that a common person can understand. And I think there's a sort of background of people in the country who are wedded to traditional practices, and some of them are good, some of them are bad, and the question is, how do you convince them to keep the good and abandon the bad? in what we're doing.
Thanks a lot, Gautam, for the talk as well as your wonderful engagement with the question that followed after the talk. Well, we're all eager to see the results of your work, and we'll keep following your work. Thank you again, Gautam.
Thank you, Chandan, and many thanks to your audience. I thought these were great questions. They were all very hard questions, and I hope I answered them to the best that I could. And I'm not the last word on this, and I couldn't be. Keep your minds open, and thank you again.
Thank you, Gautam.
Bye.